Hi, we're going to discuss themes and theories in development. In this first video, we will talk about theories, then themes. In the next video, we'll talk about contexts of development, including an international context. So your reading for this module introduced you to a variety of specific theories of development, then it grouped them into some broad perspectives. I just want to say a few words about each of these perspectives. You can get the details from your reading. But the psychodynamic perspective is rooted historically in the work of Sigmund Freud, and it has been revised and broadened by a variety of other theorists, including Erik Erikson, who is mentioned throughout your textbook. Now, a good analogy for the psychodynamic perspective is that our minds are kind of like icebergs. There's the part of ourselves that we're consciously aware of. It's sort of like the part of the iceberg above the surface of the water. But then there's a whole lot of who we are that's down below the surface that we're not consciously aware of. And yet, the part that we're not consciously aware of can still impact our thinking, feeling, and behavior. Freud divided personality into three pieces. Some, and they kind of cut across the conscious and unconscious parts of who we are. The id for Freud is the part of us that's our drives, our basic drives. The superego is our morality, it's our conscience. It's the rules we get from society about right and wrong. And then the ego is the part of development that tries to balance the id and the superego, as well as live in the real practical world. Okay? And he was focused on the id, and he broke development into a series of stages with the idea that most of our personality is developed by the age of 5, and these stages were focused on the id. They called them psychosexual stages. Erikson, in contrast, focused on the ego, and he talked about how the ego develops across the lifespan. And so related to the ego, he was thinking about psychosocial stages. So he was not talking about the id and sexuality. He was focused on things like learning how to trust, learning how to be independent, those kinds of themes. Okay? And so not only did he focus on psychosocial themes, he also focused across the entire lifespan. Okay, the behavioral perspective sees us as like blank slates. So the idea is that we are written on by experience. And so we learn to become who we are through experience, including conditioning and imitation. So for example, operant conditioning involves learning through reinforcements and punishments. The cognitive perspective is on thinking. It focuses on thinking and how our thinking influences how we think, feel, and behave across the lifespan. And in this section of your chapter, it talked about Piaget, who has a stage theory. It also mentioned the information processing perspective, which is not a stage perspective. Okay? And when we get to Unit 2, we will talk about these different cognitive perspectives and give different analogies. But for now, you can think about the mind as like a computer. Okay? And in that same section, it talked about cognitive neuroscience. I broke neuroscience apart and made it its own category here. But the idea is the brain, and how does the brain impact thinking, feeling, and behavior across the lifespan. The evolutionary perspective is rooted in Darwin's theory of evolution, including natural selection. So the idea is that as humans, we have a genetic inheritance of certain patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that we have inherited from our ancestors. They were adaptive patterns when our ancestors were evolving, and they've stayed in our genes since then. Sometimes they're adaptive now, sometimes they're not. But the idea is it's our genetic inheritance. It's our caveman brain, so to speak. And evolutionary psychologists don't try to explain everything in psychology. And even when they're focused on a topic, they're not even trying to use this as the only piece of the full explanation, but rather evolutionary psychology adds a layer of explanation when we're talking about specific issues. This will come up initially when we talk about infant attachment. Okay? Contextual theories focus on the social interaction. So Vygotsky, we will talk about in relation to his ideas about cognition. Bronfenbrenner we'll talk about in the next video in this lesson. But the key things here are context, culture, and communication. All right, and then the humanistic perspective we will address more when we get to the adult section of the course. But it's the idea that as humans, we have a basic drive for personal growth, and the end result, the goal, is self-actualization, being all that we can be. And we're kind of like plants. If we basically get what we need, then we will be able to grow and thrive and become what we should be. But sometimes there are outside forces that kind of push us off of that healthy path. Like a flower needing water and sun and nutrients, if it doesn't get quite what it needs, it doesn't grow in as healthy a way as it otherwise would. So for Unit 1, for the exam, I'd like you to have this overview from the chapter and then be sure to know the information from that last chart, Table 1, at the end of the chapter. Okay, let's spend the rest of this video looking at some themes in development. The first I want to mention is continuous versus discontinuous. Different theories fall on different ends of this theme. So continuous is gradual development, quantitative change, like a sapling becoming a larger tree. Discontinuous refers to stages or qualitative change, so like an egg becoming a pupa, then a larva, and then an adult insect. So distinct stair steps in development. Now, development is a combination of both of these, but the stage theories like Piaget and Erikson and Freud are a little more rigid than contemporary psychologists would focus on. So now there's much more attribution given to the continuous changes in development, but the stages do give us an anchor to kind of think about some key issues at different points in the lifespan. Okay? Here's another big theme, nature versus nurture. Nature includes genes, only genes. Nurture includes everything else. Parenting, neighborhoods, schools, jobs, what your mother ate when she was pregnant with you, what pesticides you're exposed to, everything else. So imagine you work in social work or law enforcement and you're working with kids who are getting into trouble. How would juvenile programs designed from a nurture view be different from those from a nature view? So pause, take a moment to reflect, and when you're ready to begin again, press play. Okay, so programs from a nature view are going to see the problem as inside the child. So it's genetic or it's chemical, and so the focus would be on containing the child, getting the child away from their environment so that they don't cause further problems. That might involve putting them into the juvenile justice system. It could involve medication or something, but the focus is on the problem in the child. Whereas a nurture view would look at all the many influences on the child. It might address parenting. It might address what's going on at school. It might address the neighborhoods. So the child is one piece of this bigger picture. And in development, and we're going to do a whole module on nature-nurture, but in development, the short answer is that everything is both. But when we're thinking about a real-world situation like the juvenile justice system, it's important to not forget the nurture piece, because nature is what it is. There's not a whole lot you can do, but it's the nurture piece where there's a lot more hope. And so I just want you to see how in the real world somebody's perspective on this philosophical issue can have a real-life impact on real people. Here's another theme, early versus later. Early is the idea that early experiences are unique, they're special, and they strongly influence later life. A later view would be that we're all equally influenced by experiences throughout life. Okay? So imagine you're a policymaker. You're in charge of deciding which kinds of programs get funded. Where might you focus your money if you have an early versus later view? Pause, take a moment to reflect, and when you're ready to begin again, press play. Okay, so if you have an early view, then you're going to funnel as much money as you can to programs related to parenting and early education. So they might be intervention programs to help parents be more effective, to not maltreat their children, and so forth. Early education might be programs like Head Start that are getting kids ready to enter public school on par with peers. But if you're funneling all the money to the early developmental programs, then you're not having money left over for later programs, and money's limited, right? And so programs for teens and older adults and so forth. So it's really tricky. I would have a very hard time being a policymaker who is in charge of funding because somebody wins, somebody loses when there's a limited number of funds. Okay? Active versus passive. An active view focuses on how we actively construct knowledge. We create our knowledge. We figure things out for ourselves. A passive view focuses on passively absorbing knowledge, kind of like a sponge. We just absorb what the environment gives us, what parents and teachers and religious authorities and whoever else, what they tell us, just passively absorbing. So imagine you're a teacher. How might you set up your classroom differently if you perceive children as active creators of knowledge versus passive sponges? Well, think about a first grade classroom. If you're taking a passive view, you're going to have desks that face front. The teacher's going to give the information. The children are going to repeat it back. There's going to be a lot of drilling of facts and so forth. Whereas an active view, there's probably going to be centers. Like, let's say you're studying potatoes as an example, and you might measure them, and then you might weigh them. You might do potato prints. You might read stories. You might do graphs of the measurements you took, right? You're figuring things out. It's hands-on, it's active. Even at the college level, hopefully you're actively reading, taking notes, asking questions. When I give you opportunities to pause and reflect, reflecting, doing the hands-on thinking and activities where I ask you to apply information to the real world in your assignments and so forth, okay? Last one, interconnected versus separate. Interconnected is the idea that domains of development mutually influence each other. Separate is that they act independently. So imagine you work with older adults who experience decreased mobility and vision. How might your approach differ if you view domains as separate versus interconnected? Well, if you see them as separate, then you're going to deal with their vision, and you're going to deal with their mobility issues, and you're not going to be thinking about how those might be impacting thinking and feeling. Whereas if you view them as interconnected, you're going to be thinking if somebody's losing their vision, or if they're no longer able to move through the world the way they used to, that's going to impact their mental health, right? It's going to impact their ability to even do basic functions like getting to the grocery store, and that's going to impact further mental health. It's going to impact their ability to interact with friends and family members. And so viewing them as interconnected will address the whole person, not just dealing with the specific issue, okay? So what I wanted you to get out of this part of the lesson is just that theories seem theoretical, right? They don't necessarily seem tied to the real world, but these different themes actually have an impact in the real world. They're not just something that you need to memorize for a test. Out in the world of work, people's attitudes on these themes can dramatically impact the welfare of their clients or students or whoever else they're working with. Okay.